AWS. Done.
Awesome. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Rohini Gaonkar. I am part of the developer advocate team at AWS and I will be the moderator for today's panel discussion on the ethics of artificial intelligence. So nowadays, it's difficult to ignore the progress of AI towards different fields, from say autonomous vehicles to user behavior predictions and or even biopharma. But on the other side, the growing sophistication and omnipresence of AI applications in our lives has also raised a number of ethical concerns. So today we will hear opinions from our esteemed speakers on the importance of implementing ethical practices when it comes to AI. But before that, I would request the speakers to introduce themselves. And let's start with you, Jayesh.
Sure. Hello, guys. Most of the attendees probably know me. I organize AWS User Group Pune over here. Work around AI. I do consultancies around cloud and AI platforms. Uh, and this is the interesting topic for me as well. Considering the ethics of AI, and it might change some of the things in the future. So it's nice to be here.
Awesome. Who wants to go next? Do you want me to go next or?
Yes, please do.
Sure. All right, awesome. My name is Scott Haynes. I'm a senior principal software engineer at Twilio. It's a cloud communications company, and if people have seen it or heard of it before, it's most likely probably behind the scenes in some of the applications that you use, like an Uber or Lyft or anything like that. So I've been working in more or less like in the field of like kind of collaborative filtering and like statistical AI for about 9 years now. And I work on the voice insights team at Twilio, making sure that our voice sounds good.
Awesome. Lizzie, want to go next?
Yeah, I'm Lizzie. I'm a developer evangelist at Twilio, focusing on educating developers and making demos. And I've been playing a lot with TensorFlow recently. Very fun. Very fun.
And I guess I'm last in the circle. So, hey everyone, my name is Nick Walsh. I'm a developer advocate at Amazon Web Services. I do a lot with AI and machine learning services here and help customers get that into action. I think sort of one of my most favorite things to do in the space of AI and ML is help to make this actionable for customers. I know a lot of people have a lot of greenfield sort of ideas of what AI can be, and those are very exciting to talk about. But I think that much in the way of the work that some of the other panelists have done here, I think there's a lot to be done with traditional statistical methods and modeling. So excited to share a little bit of the stories there and sort of the intersection of that and ethics, which I think is sort of the topic of today. So thanks.
Awesome. So thanks for the introduction. So let's begin with the topic itself. So what are your personal opinions on the fairness and the bias of the AI systems? Anyone who would like to start?
Happy to kick things off. So yeah, I mean, let's start with sort of a primer, right? If we want to have a discussion, it probably makes sense to define some terms here. So fairness, bias, AI. I mean, this is the start. So we'll start super high level, right? AI being any sort of, obviously standing for artificial intelligence, but any sort of system by which there's some sort of automated reasoning for the system to behave conditionally. I think that's sort of a really good baseline. If anyone feels differently, feel free to correct me. But that's sort of the superset. Things like machine learning and things like deep learning become subsets of that, in the way in which we decide how those systems should make their decisions is another thing. But when it comes to bias and fairness, I guess we'll start with bias. Bias would be that those decisions that a system makes would be either like unequitable or not equal to the way or not exhibiting a distribution in a way that we would expect them to or that we would want them to. I think that's, kind of ties into fairness, but does anyone have any sort of like other ways they want to sort of lay the groundwork there? Like equitability or like expectation versus reality, I think is a really big one that comes in when we talk about bias.
If is it okay if I go?
Yeah, totally.
Cool. So I think, like along the same lines of like the bias and the fairness, you're basically kind of pointing out, it's basically test sets and training sets. And if you have training sets where you're basically teaching a system to think like a human or to make a decision on behalf of a human, a lot of times that comes down to the set of data that you train it with. So if people read the news, they read you read a lot about like artificial intelligence, like with recruiting, and just by removing a name, which ungenders like the underlying potential candidate for a company, a lot of actual things happen there where people actually make it through to a phone interview, phone screening, or whatever else, where that name might have just been like, well, we trained most of our system with with male names. This is a female name. For some reason, we see that we have statistically more chance of actually hiring somebody and keeping them for 2 years if it's a male. Therefore, we're going to basically discriminate. And I think with that, like, there's a lot of those kind of notions where you see it all over the place, like from credit scores, really, you name it. Most likely, there's some kind of like bias there, and a lot of times it's explicit or implicit. And a lot of people don't even realize that they're biased until someone calls them out on it. And I think that this will lead into a lot of the other discussions. But I think about that. It's like, how do you create like a system which acts like a person you'd want to be a friend with? Is it fair? Is it kind? Does it support you? I guess it depends on if you're a good person too. But can you create something that's good for humanity?
Yeah.
I think. Oh, sorry. Are you done, Scott?
Yeah, I'm good. No worries.
I think fairness is tough to, I guess, measure. But fairness can be like a social construct. Like there can be multiple, I think, definitions. Like fairness in treatment is not necessarily fairness in outcome, per se. If we're looking at, say, the college admissions process, fairness in treatment would be making it race blind, or like just looking at like a certain test score. But fairness in outcome would mean like adjusting the decision making to only like look at certain requirements for students from, say, disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think when we blame an algorithm for something, when something goes wrong, like when darker skin does not trigger like the automatic hand soap dispenser, I think we ignore the human component because humans program algorithms, and that creeps into bias, creeps into an AI system.
Right.
One thing I wanted to sort of bring up here is I guess this exists in like many different levels across the stack, and I think especially when it comes to people being practitioners of machine learning, I think a lot of the parts where algorithms or systems break down in the way that they behave differently from what our expectations are actually more than anything just bad math and science. And so what I mean by this is that like in statistics, which underpin a lot of the methods and technologies that we use for machine learning and statistical modeling broadly, when you create a certain model with a certain degree of confidence on how it can actually perform inference or classification or regression and so on and so forth, like you have to make certain underlying assumptions about your data. And I think that one of the really common ways in which this sort of like unknown assumption gets missed is that we often assume that when we take a training set, that it is fully representative of all of the people that may end up using that. And this isn't necessarily always about malice or trying to be a good or a bad person. Like obviously everyone wants to do good science, but sometimes it's assumptions that may not be met that you may have inadvertently not checked. And so like I think we see this a lot with like a model that has a high accuracy in a training set and in research and production or research and development, and then it goes out and then we see that when it's applied to the broader class of users, there are people that would not have been represented. Now, I think tying that back to the level of fairness of like would I want an AI model to perform in the way that a person I would likely want to be friends with would behave? I think Lizzie kind of hits the nail on the head that fairness is a social construct, right? Like the reason why it's difficult for us to land on a system that behaves in such a way is because when we ask 100 people, how would you want this to behave? The answer is you're going to get 100 different answers. And, you may get some sort of normal distribution of there being some sort of central or centroid of like how people want it to broadly behave. But I think a lot of the contention is around these edge cases, right? Where people, there isn't consensus. And so, I like to say that AI and machine learning, like the modeling is an extension of the assumptions that someone injected into it. So it's like if we as humans label data in a supervised learning scenario, and we have some baseline of you can call it bias, or you can it's essentially statistical bias. That gets transferred into the model. Now, is that the fault of the algorithm, or is that the fault of the person? And then further downstream, is this a property that we need to be taking care of at the product level, or is this a property we need to take care of at the algorithm level? Because I would argue that the algorithm is sort of like non-opinionated, right? The algorithm does a test objectively; it's deterministic. If you build a product around that where you have assumptions and tests and live data that's not in line with what your intended sort of experiment was, well, this is where the mismatch starts to happen. I'm really curious what everyone thinks about that, because I think that bad science and bad math is the root of a lot of this. And I know ML, making it accessible, is important, but then the trade-off is that it becomes even harder to maintain a quality bar that I think that everyone sort of really wants.
I can interject, I think, if that's cool.
I often
Josh,
think
you
the
go.
people, when we talk about so I often think when we talk about fairness and bias, people look biased through the lens of fairness. Like when we talk about fairness, then as Lizzie said, there might be like different definitions. Fairness might be different for every individual. So one thing which is fair for one person might be unfair for another. So this kind of variance in the definition, or this kind of different these different types of fairness play different role in different with different algorithms or different modeling or different problems you are trying to solve. So what do you guys think? Like how can we generalize this fairness as a concept for general AI problem?
I think a lot of this stuff
So
kind of
will
goes.
there
Oh,
be
sorry.
any possibility that
I was going to say, so if you think about like the panel discussion being like the ethics in like artificial intelligence, and you think about like the codes of ethics, and how is it that moral thinkers create codes of ethics, whether or not they are moral or amoral, and a lot of times, like if you think about like creating a system that is fair, within like a normal distribution of fairness, kind of going back to like this this concept that you're not going to make something that makes everybody happy, because we're all kind of polarized as people. But it's like, can you encode, that code of ethics into, a thinking system? So, basically, to Nick's point, the machine learning model is like a kid, and you teach it whatever you're going to teach it, if it's a bad habit or a good habit, and it's going to basically represent that with what it does in the future. So if you can encode it with a good code of ethics that people agree upon, then, that's good enough. That's, if most people are happy with the way that it acts, then that's good. But also, if you do find that you bring this thing into production, you have to continuously update like the models as well. If it's not fair, but it seemed fair, then you have to go back and get more data. And a lot of times, I feel like that's only really passed over in the absence of a good ability to recreate that data and get that back again because of the cost. But that's my 2 cents on like the code of ethics, and I don't know a good way to answer that, because it's like it almost becomes government at that point, where you need a quorum of people to agree upon things, and then nothing happens. So
Yeah. Lizzie, sorry, go ahead if you wanted to say something.
Thanks. I was just wondering, like, at what point does an AI system gain, I guess, like, legal status to an extent? Like, for the question of ethics, who would take the blame if a self-driving car is in an accident? Like the programmers, the end users. If there's a user override, what if the override goes wrong? And I think, like, because humans are biased and humans have their own like lack of morals, humans are not perfect. That means that to an extent, AI systems will never be completely moral. Like there'll always be some bias involved. Like some group will be left out because maybe humans who program an AI system leave out some underrepresented group from their data set. And then that data set is not recognized when it's finally in production. So you need to be cognizant of the input data, of course.
Yeah, I think this is obviously like a very important topic, right? Like understanding sort of the implications for users by putting products out in the world that make automated decision making. What does the auditing, like where should fault lie? And I think that it's like, I think there should be some sort of value criterion by which we sort of assess how much these systems should be scrutinized. Mainly, what is the potential for impact? Mainly in the form of harm. Ideally, something that can be more good can also we can have a small blast radius for when it goes wrong. But for things like self-driving cars, obviously, I think that it sort of has the ability to stand on both sides there simultaneously, right? You don't get one without the other. But I think that like even more upstream for like who is the fault to blame in an accident where this may happen, or, you know, like there's so many levels of the stack here, right? So I think there's like, you know, in a perfect scenario where we get clean data in you know the live scenario and that comes in, you know, like if everything works as intended in terms of there being no sort of breakdown there, who is to blame? But I think that another issue is sort of like, you know, when we think about like one example I'll bring up here is like the Uber self-driving car example, and I think it was Arizona or the southwestern U.S. Where, you know, a self-driving car technology is powering a vehicle on the road, and because of, I guess you could call it maybe like the false sense of security, the systems were not able to detect someone during in a given situation because it was night and it was a bend in the road. And when we talk about fault is sort of something we recursively prescribe based on sort of all of the facts about a situation. And so like one could argue that, you know, in that scenario, that person shouldn't have been at that point in the road at that time. So is it the burden of the AI system to be able to work in that sort of situation? Now, I'll even go a step further and break down the AI, like the model from the production product, because they're separate, right? Like you can ship a model as a part of a product because the product is intended and prescribed for a certain narrower band of use case than every single piece of data you could ever throw at it under the sun. This is how we design products, right? Like no one would be upset if their hairdryer didn't work underwater. It's a good example of this. And so it's like when we talk about fault, it's like, you know, fault is both non-binary and that is like may not exclusively be of one party, but also that it's, you know, like there are some accidents that may happen that I would argue could be no fault and are just expected parts of this normal distribution, right? You know, I think it becomes very dicey when there's like a product that gets introduced that one person gets to opt into as like a consumer that can affect someone else who doesn't opt out or can't opt out. But I think maybe that's, you know, a broader discussion, right? Like I think AI for sort of like self-serving purposes is one thing where we can make that sort of calculus for ourselves. You know, what does everyone think about like a decision that someone else makes that can affect you on your behalf?
I think a lot of those the points there, a lot of it bubbles up to like the umbrella of like decision intelligence and like decision making, just like in general as like a core theory. So if you think about like decision theory and, you know, accountability, a lot of that kind of all bubbles back up to that. So like with decision intelligence, you're using a, you know, a machine learning system that derives a, you know, a probability for an answer, and then that decision has to basically be, you know, decided upon and acted upon. And a lot of times you think about like, okay, well, what does it take to act? So, you know, going back to the bend in the road, if the system acted, you know, with a high probability that there's nothing in the road, then it's really no different than like anybody else at fault. You know, you go down to drink your coffee, you look up, you've gotten an offender bender. We're not, you know, running at 99.9999% accuracy as people. And these systems, you know, they can run at like maybe 90% accuracy, which is great because it takes a lot of that cognitive burden off of people when they're trying to drive. You know, if you're a little bit tired, then it will help you. But if you're so tired that you're falling asleep at the wheel, it's a different problem as well. Because we had that accident in California, and, you know, not going into, you know, gritty details or anything else, you know, it was basically a Tesla that, you know, really kind of couldn't make a decision between if it needed to go left or right. So it just hit the center. And, you know, nothing's perfect. I think with a lot of this stuff, like we expect this perfection from these systems that, you know, really, I mean, work fairly well, you know, but it's all it's, you know, it's all uncertainty. So how well can something work when it's, you know, given a problem that it's never seen before? It's like the unknown unknown. And, you know, adapting to that kind of change is always something that, you know, if you haven't been able to kind of, you know, foresee that problem, then the system doesn't know how to act. So then at that point, should it just stall? You know, what does it do? And I think that's like the harder problem is, you know, how do you train it to make a decision outside of the scope of what it's made decisions in before?
And again, when it comes to decision making, there are like various implications for various problems we have. So one of the paper I read, in which the guy was like identifying wolves from the images, and the model was identifying wolves using the background. So whenever there's snow in the background, it will identify it as a wolf. So this like instead of going for the features of the part we want to identify, like we want to discriminate between cat and dog, and instead of going for the features for the cat or dog, it is going for the features for the background. So this again comes to the part of explainability and decision making, and what kind of how the AI model is basically thinking about the whole thing, and how it is processing the data and what features it's extracting. These are all things affect the what end decision is there and how it's going to behave in the real life scenario, I guess.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to bring up here is, piggybacking off one of those previous points is about like what is the ground truth for assessing, like the effectiveness of AI. I know that sounds like something that should be fairly objective, but I think that when we see it play out, even for a lot of people that are, very statistical in nature or like the way that they are analytical, there's still some subjectivity here. A bit of a trolley problem, I guess you could say, where you can come up with one sort of objective value criterion, which is minimizing number of accidents per number of miles driven in a car scenario, right? Where we say that like, okay, well, in Camp A, where we have human drivers, and we have Camp B, where we have, let's say, self-driving cars or AI-driven vehicles. In Camp B, if there are fewer accidents per 100,000 miles or per mile driven, then this is objectively better. Now, by that value criterion, that may be correct. But I think that there's a lot of uneasiness because every accident is not made the same. And I don't mean this in that these accidents in sort of, either camp are more severe, but rather some of the accidents that happen as edge cases in the AI scenario, people start to feel uneasy or doubt some of the objectivity of these metrics because those accidents they perceive as things that they could have easily caught. Examples of this being like the California sort of divider incident. Just to shed a little more color on that, essentially, there's an on ramp, and then the on ramp was just the light hit it a weird way, and apparently the AI system wasn't able to detect it, and so instead of sort of properly merging, it kind of just went onto the up to the divider. And so when we as people think that there's a lot of this perception of like, well, AI is supposed to be better. It's not necessarily that AI is better at everything all of the time and across the board. And simultaneously, that doesn't mean that AI is still not may not be the net increase in sort of the value criterion that we do all agree on. I think a lot of the public discourse around this doesn't necessarily help that. It's valuable to report on some of these incidents or cases where AI can go wrong. But I think that when we really want to solve the same problem here, which is how do we make our roads safer? How do we automate decision making, whether that's more reliance on humans or more reliance on semi-automated systems or any sort of amount of human in the loop scenario. I think that like the discussion oftentimes becomes very granular when and it loses sight of sort of the broader problem we're trying to solve, where you don't really get sort of the benefit without some of these drawbacks.
I think we're looking at what tasks are best suited to AI, like how depends on the task, how repetitive, how predictable, like definitely single domain. Like Deep Blue can kill it at chess, but like Deep Blue sucks at checkers. Like, and I think, as you mentioned, Nick, like there's edge cases that you can't always plan for. And that's why, to an extent, I think AI will not surpass humans because humans are better suited to handling edge cases, I think.
There's along that line, Lucy, like there's an interesting book. I'm gonna basically blank right now on the name of it. I think it's called The Beautiful Species, and it's all about how creativity affected humans' ability to really kind of evolve like through nature. So, if you're a logical thinker, you're going, okay, well, I need to survive. What do I need to do to survive? Okay, I can go get food. I could do something else. But, human at a certain point in evolution, we started, playing music. We started, coming up with our own languages. And, this kind of notion of creativity is something that I think is like, it's interesting because like you're now kind of starting to see that, we can teach AI to draw. We can teach AI to paint a picture, to compose a song, to play along like a melody, like in like GarageBand, you can play a virtual band. And a lot of that stuff is kind of interesting, but it's also kind of prescripted. So, you know, it can play within the bounds of like the box that we put the AI into. And it's interesting. You think about, like, you know, if anyone's read like a bunch of like Ray Kurzweil or anything else, like you have this notion of like at a certain point, like you have, you know, a conscious thinking system. And I think right now, like, we don't know what that's going to look like. And that's kind of also like the fear of AI. It's like, you know, at what point does it surpass our human intelligence? And at what
Yeah.
point, you know, are we now worried that we created a monster? And it's, you know, it's like how Frankenstein kind of, you know, approach to things. I don't know if anyone has anything else to say about that.
Yeah,
either.
I mean, do you think that AI in future will surpass human cognitive abilities at one point, or do you think that is like way ahead in the future?
There's one more point on the similar lines that when we're talking about accuracy matrix, the accuracy, we always compare the AI performance with human performance, and when it comes to human performance, it's not always accurate. So we consider that considering that this AI model behaves like 93% with 93% accuracy. That's with respect to the human, considering that human accuracy is 100%, and that's not always the case. So we still don't have very perfect way to describe how accurate AI is, because there might be like human errors as well. So I was working on the similar problems like document segmentation problems in my with my earlier client, and there were so many discussions around the same thing that when we classify particular clause, like human classifies particular clause, they might miss some of the data over there, and we are training our model in the similar data. So our model has a very less accuracy when compared to the when it compared to the actual human accuracy. So those kind of issues are also there.
Yeah, so exactly what you're describing is like sort of what is ground truth, what is the threshold for effectiveness of AI. I mean, I mentioned before where it's not, even if we can agree sort of as a society or as decision makers that there's an objective criterion that we will assess humans versus an AI system, even in instances where the objective criterion is met, there is still some ways to subjectively have to make that decision. Like in the car accident scenario, if it's deemed an easy accident, we may not want that to have avoided for humans. We may not want that. Even if it still reduces mileage or accidents per unit mileage. I think another thing to determine here is I think there's like a really big leap in like the scope of how so there's two things. Like there's the scope of how we leverage AI systems and how we let them play a role in our lives. And then there's also, well, okay, let's just start with that, right? So for example, I think there's a very large leap, even in like a self-driving car example, right? The AI system, if we look at it as a huge black box where like it's getting inputs from all of the road around it and its output is just decisions that it makes in terms of like steering and gas and braking, right? That's like assume a fully automated system. Now, I think that like the constituent parts of that AI system are like, you know, the one camera on the side that detects like how predicts maybe how far a car may be from it. You know, I know infrared is not a prediction; it's like an exact thing for some like, you know, side mirror detection. But essentially, like you have a sort of meta AI system where you have like AI systems working to perform individual detections on individual sort of entities, or you may have one single model that sort of handles everything. And I think that like we as humans are very sort of comfortable with the idea of like, well, use AI as a tool. I think very few people are sort of like trying to push back against that, where it's like we can perform all these predictions, and a lot of people are very comfortable at the end of the day if like human still sort of pushes the button to perform an action, right? And now, you know, like when we think about like, well, what problems do we want AI to really solve for us or be automated? This sort of becomes a big question, right? Like there's in medicine, another example is like I think there are a lot of examples where it's not necessarily that AI systems can supersede cognitive abilities of doctors, but rather that because of human constraints, like the amount of time you can spend looking at a given, you know, like a radiological image, or, you know, just like the contrast or like how much coffee you had that day, right? Those inconsistencies happen in the normal human distribution. Those don't happen in the AI system. But this is all sort of like predicated on the fact that humans labeled those images, right? So it's like when we talk about AI systems having like superhuman, super cognitive abilities, well, if the accuracy or the ability of them to actually perform inference is bottlenecked by the need for us to have labeled images, or labeled data sets, then I sort of think like it gates the conversation around like AGI, artificial general intelligence, sort of like becoming this looming specter. Do I think that at some indeterminate point in the future that we may, as humans, develop sort of better systems that can make unsupervised learning really, really effective, or take like hybrid approach where it's like we seed it with some supervised learning and then it can have some unsupervised learning or reinforcement learning? Maybe, but I think that is very far fetched, and I think the far fetched in terms of like our current sort of timeline and what we were worried about right now. From a policy perspective, like, should we jump the gun on that? I think that's another conversation. But I think, do we as like people need to worry about this like being too far past the point of no return or anything? I think that's like there's very little evidence to show of that, either an R&D or a product perspective, which typically trails the R&D side.
So you did talk about the black box, right? So we see a lot of these cutting edge AI algorithms that operate today are like black boxes, right? Where the algorithms are definitely only capable to be understood by the computers. Do you have any opinions on how important it is to open up these black boxes further?
I can start there. So I think that one of the things that you'll kind of find across the board. So you have all these frameworks, like whether it's like scikit-learn, it's MLlib and Spark, it's any of like the SageMaker stuff from Amazon. There's a lot of different ways to kind of use like AutoML, and then from that, a lot of people don't really understand how is it that the model really came to the conclusions that it came to. And for a lot of that stuff, if you think about going back to the whole bias and fairness question, if you don't know exactly how it is that the model trained itself, what are the features that it's encoded into its thinking? There's really no way to really understand whether or not you're actually approaching it with any kind of fairness. So I think like there's, on one hand, it's really quick to do, AutoML, get to the point where something has been, trained off of maybe, someone else's system. You got like, Google AutoML. If you want to basically, pick up from where it's, left off with image recognition, great. You can start off with like a base neural network. But for a lot of stuff, like if you don't really understand how something works, then there's not really like a great way to know whether or not it's doing exactly what you want it to do. And I think that black box itself, like you see it like all over, software, not just like in artificial intelligence, but if you feed something into the system and then something happens and then something comes back out, a lot of times, like I find like, at least like for myself, like I really want to know what's going on, and you want to dig further into it to be able to say, well, I'm even just excited about how this is working. And I think a lot of people really should break into that the black box to find out why it is that something is doing what it's doing. Also to fix those potential problems, which make it, an unethical system as well.
I do think it's most important to open up the black box to build trust and transparency, so people do understand the training data, the inputs, what's making the AI system make a decision.
Yeah, and I think this topic that can broadly be categorized as like observability into or I'm blanking, but like the explainability in AI. That's sort of the umbrella term here. In the class of things that I think are either like a research problem or like a engineering or an implementation problem, I think this one actually falls much more on the implementation side, and I'll explain sort of that hot take. Like when people think about AI systems being black boxes, I don't think there's any question as to the ability to understand how an algorithm works, right? Like the algorithm is math and it's deterministic. If you feed it the same set of inputs, it will always provide you the same set of outputs. And while that's very difficult to understand, and people spend entire PhDs crafting and creating and making new algorithms for us to use, or neural network architectures, what have you, at the end of the day, that algorithms, we understand how that algorithm behaves in terms of when we give it a set of inputs, what the set of outputs are. Now, the issue becomes much more of an implementation problem, because we as humans think that like, okay, if I have 10 pictures of myself and I pass all 10 of those pictures in my head think those are all 10 pictures of myself and I want them to be classified similarly. But I'm not understanding how the algorithm is interpreting those images, and that's not because of the fault of the algorithm. That's kind of the fault of like, well, I was just promised that, in this computer programming world that we live in, here's a function, it has inputs, it has outputs, and I expect it to behave sort of at this way. And the abstraction, it still exists, but like it breaks down when you don't understand how the underlying tool sort of works. So I see this as like, there is a very large need for testing software or it's a multifaceted problem, right? Like, you need to be able to have like common standards around data sets. I would really love to see in the coming future things like some sort of, W3C equivalent for like data sets on people worldwide, right? Like maybe that are these unsort of fudgeable test sets that certain applications that perform tasks on common sort of subjects could be tested against to serve as a common benchmark. I think that like every company sort of having to make their own sort of data set for something that is not differentiated is not really a competitive advantage. It's more of just like undifferentiated heavy lifting. Like if there was a way to say like, hey, we're creating a tool that is supposed to, be able to effectively identify faces, let's say for like Face ID or, some equivalent sort of product, right? Like if there's, and there is, I think, regulation, there's a role for regulation here. And I think this is a great place where like something like a government agency could sort of step in and say, hey, well, here's a standard sort of test suite where you have to perform, and pass certain, levels of accuracy or coverage for these mutually agreed upon sort of things. Because otherwise, then it's like, it's just on each company to determine what is good enough in terms of like who it works for and who it doesn't. This, again, looping back to Lizzie's point around like the unknown unknowns of like people that may not be represented in your data set. So yeah, I see that that's much less of a research problem and that the algorithm is a black box and more of the system that's built on top of that algorithm being a black box because of the lack of tools. I think people all want their systems to work largely for everybody, not too much consensus or lack of consensus there. It's just like the acquisition of data sets that are super like as close to the superset of like the live data as possible is just really, really hard problem. And I think the tooling just isn't really there yet. Like you mentioned, whether you use TensorFlow, scikit-learn, you're using some of the SageMaker built-in algorithms, what have you. I just think the tooling has progressed very quickly. And in terms of the advanced testing suites, I'm sure there are some companies that have internal tools that they've built, but I think in terms of mass market and open source explainability tools, I just really don't think it's there yet. And I think that it's maturing, and I think we'll get there. I think that these conversations are really important because that helps to sort of spur and motivate those projects to move forward.
And actually, we need to get there because if you go through GDPR regulations, there's actually a regulation that if there's any algorithmic decision or any automated decision and it's affecting anyone's life or anyone in any way, that person can actually ask the regulatory body for the explanation, like how the decision is being made and how that model is implicating the decision. So those kind of explanations or those kind of things should come into picture for this as well.
Anyone wants to add to the point?
I really
Great.
like Nick. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Nick, I really like what you say about like standards, especially because I think computers, AI, now have a lot of power. Like they're tasked with making decisions worth like millions, billions, lots of dollars, money, and they have like a high stake in human safety and health, and yet they still make mistakes. So I think we definitely need to understand where they're coming from, and there should be a standard if we're going to trust their decision making.
Yeah, and I think that like even in the scenario where an AI system may perform better on an objective metric, to sort of tie this all back around, like humans have emotions, right? And so those sort of weigh in how we assess certain scenarios. I think humans broadly feel really bad when they're robbed of agency. And so like one of the things here is like, I think people feel a lot better at the end of the day if a human makes a mistake that causes a harm than if an AI system causes a mistake, because there's sort of this plausible deniability that like, well, if I was in that situation, or like we could just change that person, what they would do next time, right? Like, and so like I think this is a very sort of emotional. Some of these outcomes are extremely emotional, right? Like especially if it comes down to harm to other people. But I think that this is this exact point is why it's so hard to determine a consistent set of ethics that is prescriptive across an entire population of people, because everyone will have slightly different opinions here, and so it comes down to the question of like, well, what are then the tasks that we allow AI to do? And I know this is an open-ended question. There is no real sort of answer for it, and I think that we as a society globally will sort of ebb and flow, and like maybe will allow, in certain countries they'll have different opinions, right? That this is how differences in culture and thoughts and beliefs, and there'll be ebb and flow, right? There will be points where maybe certain systems will grant them more power, and then we'll see the effects, and we'll see like, is that a scenario we want or not want, and then maybe it'll flow back in the opposite direction. I think that, again, automated decision making is something that we've had for a very long time here, and not to sort of soapbox, but it's like, statistics, a lot of the underpinning of this have been used to make decisions and set things like costs and rates for decades now. If you have any form of insurance, this is sort of this at work, right? Like, your inputs as in the form of your personal data are features for a model that determine how much you should be charged for this company to break even, to provide this service, and then make some sort of profit on top of that. And so I think this raises a larger question, especially with things like GDPR that you mentioned, which is ownership of data and agency over data. I think that like this is not a new question with AI and ML, but I think it definitely brings it to the forefront. I think it always feels kind of weird. Some like people are very torn on the things like personal advertising, right? Some people love that they get served recommendations for things that they want to buy. Other people feel like offended, right? So this is where even one application of AI with the same set of data or the same features from two different people can have wildly different responses. So yeah, it's there's a lot to consider, lots and lots to discuss.
Definitely. So we all agree that it comes down to the quality of the data that you have that will ensure what is the end result. But if we come towards privacy, right? Privacy of data. For example, if we talk about what is happening in healthcare. So if we want to build an AI system that is able to provide best course of action under any uncertainty, it needs that kind of data to be able to process it, right? So in such cases, what is the general consensus? Like, would you be give up your privacy in order to allow these future systems to work better? What would be your opinions about that?
I have a fairly strong opinion with that. Recently, I guess recently is like everything's kind of relative. So like 2 or 3 years ago, my stepfather had a heart attack. He survived because they called an ambulance. The ambulance basically gave him like it's like an under the tongue drug that basically puts you almost into a coma, and then he went to the hospital. Had they made the decision to just drive to the hospital because this might not have been a big deal, he would have died. But the other thing too is that like you think about like more and more like not even just like the malpractice, but you think about like people try their best under like a really kind of a heavy pressure situation. It's like, oh, I think I'm having a stroke. I'm going to convince myself I'm not going to really call the hospital, and then bad things happen. Same things happen when people have heart attacks. Is it a panic attack? Is it a heart attack? I'll probably just survive. This is fine. I'll just go to bed early or something like that. I think like in the ability, in the not even like the far future. Like you think about like the Apple Watch like automatically calling, the hospital for emergency services when it sees EKG values kind of change. Like all of that stuff is kind of here now. Whether or not it actually works or not is a different thing. But if you think about like, does somebody have an allergy? How hard is it for, first responders to get information about a person versus just interviewing the only person who's around when that person, gets into the ambulance? If the person's already passed out, they're going to try their best. They're going to administer like one of two medicines that they have on board, and they're going to hope for the best. And for a lot of that stuff, like if you have the ability to basically, scan somehow, I don't know if it's chips in people, however that goes in the future, but you have the ability to basically scan, identify a person, pull up that medical record, pull up all kind of history of things that went right and went wrong. Then like, the ability for the automated system to think about how to best prescribe personal care, I think is something that's very helpful, especially like, you think about right now, with coronavirus, like, is there something that could help somebody based on, prior medical, I don't have a good word for it, but, just prior medical history? Could they make the right decision? Like, is this person, is a certain drug going to, give this person an asthmatic reaction, and then they're going to get on a ventilator and things are going to go bad? I think like right now, everything's kind of, it's a kind of scary world we were living in, but, to take part of that human emotion out. So we were talking before about like, emotive response and things like that. If you have a system that just is making decisions based on like, prior courses of action, history, and probability, most likely that would be better under a high pressure situation than a person who's feeding off of emotion during like a stressful time. That's my 2 cents there. And also the other part too, I would give up privacy because I've already really given up privacy if it's better for my overall outcome. And I think that's like the silver lining of HIPAA as well is, my data can be shared as long as the course of action improves my potential healthcare. And that's like the scary silver lining also with HIPAA. But that's that.
But again, that brings us to the earlier part. Then who will be accountable for if there's any misbehaving for the whole thing? Like if anything goes wrong, who will be accountable for the whole thing?
I think in that case, goes back to like the legal system at that point too, because you think about like it's a doctor under uncertainty making the best decision that they can. It goes wrong and a family sues. That doctor is going to use their prior history of solving the same kind of problems, or they're going to do like a quick on the fly interview of the other doctors, like within the ER, I guess at that point. At that point, it's like go into surgery, don't go into surgery, and how fast can we potentially fix this problem? I think that there's I think doctors get like a bad rap for a lot of the stuff when they're trying like their best. But I think at the end of the day, like everybody, when it's life or death, people are always emotionally involved in that and invested in like the outcome. And when it doesn't go the way that they want it to, it's always we're going to blame somebody because I want action. And I think that the hard part there is that it really is like we don't all live forever, and life happens. And I think it's really hard to figure out who's on the receiving end of things when they don't go right. Was it the wrong decision? And I think that even if it's a computer doing it and there's an incorrect outcome, like in the Uber use case, it tried its best. And what how do we quantify that? Trying our best.
Yeah, exactly. A lot. It's really hard to take the human emotion out of it. I mean, I know I've tried to preach the whole idea of like let's agree on a value criterion, but I think that you just named a scenario where it's like, well, if it tugs at the heartstrings and that's what's important to you, we need to find ways to codify these subjective things into things that could be more objective, and that's a hard problem. But I think it's something that everyone is trying to work towards in the long run. I think one thing that is really important to me, sort of going back to the original question, is like control, like data agency. I said this before, like do I feel comfortable opting in to allow like systems to use my personal data? And I think that like the concern is oftentimes like, yeah, well, there's the idea of like, well, an AI system can go wrong, but if I've already opted in, assume I'm an educated consumer, I've made sort of that pros versus con weighing, and I've agreed that like I want to partake in this trade-off, right? I think the issue becomes there's two downstream issues. First is that like when my data gets vended to other providers or other tools without my consent directly, and consent, you can phrase that a lot of ways. I don't think implicit consent or like tacit consent works. Explicit opt-in, right? Like if I'm not explicitly opted into having my data vended to other sources, that's something I don't like. Secondarily, should I choose to, should the situation for the pros and cons change, like the product changes, for example, or there's more information about it, or maybe just my opinions change, even if the product has not changed, I want to have the ability to be able to cut off vending my data to that vendor and remove any sort of semblance maybe of my data that they have. These are two things that I think like there's still a lot in the way of legislation and even just public discourse, right? Like in the same example of insurance, I'm fairly certain there's a lot of like data that gets sort of bundled into your insurance company for various sorts of insurances that you may have throughout your life that is still able to be reprocured and redistributed to other agencies, right? So even separate from AI, I think the concept of data agency is something that is more fundamental. And I think GDPR in Europe takes a lot of steps in the right direction here in terms of starting consumer first and then working up to build systems on top of that. And I know that was a very stark sort of change for a lot of people like us, like application developers. We have to drastically alter the way in which we may build certain applications, regardless of whether we had any ill intent, right? But sometimes it's that level of deliberateness to build a system that is truly, people first, or grants that agency by default, is the way I would phrase it.
I guess like government regulated transparency or auditing the vendor for constantly for the data they have, how they are using it, or what, the constant auditing might help in this purpose. Like we can regulate the things with the auditing and transparency.
I think we need a code of conduct, like
Yes.
uh, just like to say what the company or the AI system will use the data for, and that they will not use it for malicious purposes, and
Advertising.
outlining. Yeah,
But right there, when you say won't use it for malicious purposes, like that's the entire issue, right? Like
Yeah.
that is a completely. I mean, like I don't like using the phrase weasel word because it implies that someone is deliberately trying to use something that presents as one thing, but to go the other way. But like, no one would disagree that we shouldn't use things for bad purposes, right? Like, I don't think anyone in a board meeting would be like, oh, nope, yeah, sorry, cross that one off, right? The question becomes that, like, for a company, something that could be good for them that they perceive as not detrimental to their user, I could have very different feelings about how that infringes on privacy rights or that makes me feel very uncomfortable, right? And that becomes like, at what level do we sort of impose these limitations, right? I think that like when it comes to like government level things, GDPR is so radical because it's this very prescriptive sort of guidance at a very national level. Whereas typically you could sort of find like, all right, well, if there's this whole field of topics that we sort of want to talk about, if we can all agree on like a small part of them, maybe we implement those at the largest level, like the national level. And then as you go down more granular, like state and local, or like individual sects of business and verticals, we start to get more and more prescriptive guidance. And that's why I think GDPR again was so sort of monumental. Like it just took this very firm stance at such a wide stage, that it becomes tough, and then it becomes like, well, what are the things sort of the furthest downstream that we can't get consensus on, and basically no regulation would have some sort of wide ranging support, right? And I think that like we're very far in many ways around the conversation of AI from being able to implement things like that, or like implement policy, I think, in a way that people really understand. I think that a lot of the conversation still is very surface level, and there's not a lot in the way of being able to really place the pros with the cons. I think sometimes they get sort of presented separate from one another, and I think that a lot of education is just a really large part of being able to first make decisions and have advocacies for plans that people are going to want to get behind or understand fully.
And even GDPR doesn't mention the word AI anywhere. So they define it as automated decision or algorithmic decision. So that, again, like there's a lot of things to be done before we reach at a level where AI is very prominent, and it's being and there's a need to regulate things around AI. So we are still a bit far from that, but I don't know if we are very far from that situation. Maybe it will be case in 4, 5, or 6 years.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I think also, I mean, if you think about the like kind of like the other ramifications of like data governance, GDPR, like HIPAA, all these other kind of standards that are out for potentially the the benefit of the end user. A lot of them, like, it was interesting. Like a lot of them talk like, so GDPR was one of the first ones that was talking about just data protection. How is it that you protect that end user's data? A lot of them don't talk necessarily more about the privacy of that data, given that your data, your behavior can be encoded as like a unique identifier. It's not me, but like this is the same kind of problem that started like back in the day when Apple introduced like the IDFA. So it's, here's your ID for ad. It's unique per application, and then you basically just have an aggregator that can then link that back to the IP address of the phone you've now found that person again. So like for a lot of these cases, you think about like almost like it's like the black market of data or whatever else, and that untrust. It's like even if even if an entity that has the data is trying to do the right thing, there's always the notion of like potentially bad actors in the system. We're able to kind of really identify that user and then use it for advertising. You think about that, like in a future where a lot more of your data is now like online, it can be collected by entities outside of your own knowledge of that. How does that benefit the company that could profit from that? So you think about um, using your medical data to enhance I don't know, your fitness, your fitness routines or whatever else. that's good. Not necessarily a bad thing. It's just helping you to basically become, better, have your own kind of personalized training or something else. But then it's like, the other side of that is using, the collective behavior of you as a person to, identify what should be, shown to you at the right time of day so that you purchase something, or that, you vote for, say a president, like just because something kind of keeps on flashing. It's like that whole, like, the native advertising that is kind of layered in and targeted directly towards you. Like that's like that's for me, it's like, that's what, the end result of what happens when things go bad, with this kind of like, I guess, I don't know, unaudited, non-transparent, view of your own data. And, you hope that people do the right thing. You hope that companies do the right thing. And, I don't know, that code of ethics, even if it's there, I think it's one of those things that people they try their best to skirt around it, if they can, just because it might actually be easier, to ask for forgiveness later than to, go and use something to, get a cheap win or something else. I don't know. That's my thoughts.
Cool. So we did talk about how it can be developed in future, but let's talk about something that is already here. That is something like deep fake technology that we see, right? So we've seen a lot of improvements with the face and voice generation algorithms, right? So they can be used. These methods are known. We have seen practical uses of these methods being abused, right? So what is your thought? Should we stop researching, or should we think of how we are researching or implementing these improvements? And what is your take around that?
So I wouldn't call it a radical take, but one that I think that is not talked about very widely, which is that like a lot of things come down to like what we accept as true and objective sources of data going forward will change with deepfakes. And I don't think that it necessarily comes down to the burden of like regulation to alter this. I think that like this will be a fundamental shift in what we consider to be legitimate and objective data. So in the same way that like when Photoshop or image manipulation came around, it wasn't sort of like on the government to come down and like crack down on people photoshopping things, right? Now, if the intent is that you are in fact like fraudulently copying a document, well, that's fraud, right? That's covered under existing sort of laws. And so it's like, I see that this is not all that different with deepfakes. And now, there are clearly very many sort of new attack vectors for doctoring video and doctoring audio. But I think in the same way that there's this healthy level of skepticism, and there's ways that we look at things and are like, hey, that's a little too good to be true, or maybe this doesn't look quite right, or maybe there's always the possibility that's photoshopped. And even if I have no way to determine that, the fact that we accept that it can exist is something that's an important sort of like understanding. And I see this coming with deepfakes too. I see that like, with GANs, generative adversarial networks, the underlying technology here, you get scenarios like deepfakes in the same exact world where they can be used to generate beautiful pieces of media that can change the way we make movies, songs, and audio and paintings, and applying style transfer and powering applications we love to use, right? So it comes down to then, so it's not just like, hey, this technology is net good or net bad. It's like, well, there's much like many things, that technology can be used in many different ways. I think the deepfakes inherently are not even bad, right? Like a deepfake is almost prescribing intent to or a negative intent to a use of using GANs for this format, right? Like, I don't know, would you call like a movie that's generated with GANs a deepfake? I don't know, right? And so it's like, then it comes down to like, well, do we assess, is it about intent or impact? And I think that a lot of processes in our legal systems sort of already exist to assess these sort of things. And I think that already we're seeing a whole wide spectrum, right? So like, we're going to get the good with the bad. And the next steps that we want to take are sort of up to us. But I think that things like blanket bans, or even a lot on the way of like new and additional policy and legislation may not be the right answer.
It again goes to ethics of humans.
Sorry, what was that? Internet cut out a little bit.
I was saying it again goes to ethics of humans, like how morally we treat the whole thing, like how we treat the whole thing defines if it's bad or not. So
Okay.
I also think, I mean, to the other point too, like, I think that if you think about, a deep fake being used like as an artistic expression, I know that I can't remember the name of the platform, but there's a company that's basically created the ability to create video game scenes just by talking and saying, okay, I want a scene that has, a forest with a lake, and it's now going to, project a forest and a lake. And for some of these things, that's not bad. The computer understands, what a forest is, what a lake is. It can generate like a beautiful scene that's, capturing like a specific emotion or whatever else, and that's kind of cool. Like I think it was Howard Cohen. I can't remember if that's the right name. So back in like the 80s at MIT, Howard Cohen was working on creating like AI that could paint pictures, and it was basically like the ability for it to back in the 80s. It's funny because like we didn't really have the ability to basically like use ImageNet or anything else to train anything. But in MIT, they were working on like their AI lab, and they're trying to figure out how to how can you get a system to dream. Can you say, hey, what did you think about yesterday? What is it that you dreamt about? And it's, going to now paint a picture of what it was thinking about. And I think that's kind of an interesting, expression of artificial intelligence in like a different, different complete aspect. It's not, it's not a bad thing. It's not being used, for, this kind of, this dark, seedy underworld. But it's actually being used for, that creative expression. And I think that that's, the positive side of like what's happening with like the deep fake in general is you're teaching a system how to recognize real things in the real world and then create a bunch of copies of that, and that could be used for training future systems in a positive way as well.
Makes sense. Anyone wants to add to that before we move on to the next topic?
I think this could be a good segue to looking at like how tech can be used for bad, but it also can be used for good.
Yeah. So definitely, I mean, that's where I was also going towards. Like, we have talked about a lot of concerns. We've talked a lot about a lot of ethics related to AI, but then we all agree that AI has it has a vast potential to improve and enrich our lives, right? So just wanted to give a last round to all of you to talk about your silver linings, any positive note that we can end this discussion on.
I guess I'll start. So I think like, when we talk about ethics, like ethics exist on both the good and the bad, right? Like if you are giving advantages to people or people are receiving benefits, it's also the conversation of ethics is around expanding that to as many people as possible, right? And this is why the conversation around democratizing AI is something that you hear a lot about, because in the same way that, people could be harmed, if you're giving advantages to subsets of people, then this could in a way be considered inequitable. And so, like, I'm really happy that there has been a large amount of democratization and opening of these tool sets to a larger amount of people. I think a large part of the conversation around ethics is actually predicated on the fact that these tools have become available to more and more and more people. And so like, I'd much rather have the conversation of like, how do we, make sure that people can use these tools effectively than like, how do we open up the tools so that more people can access them? I'm really happy that, like a lot of people are able to take, these frameworks like TensorFlow, scikit-learn, and so on, and PyTorch, so on and so forth, and actually get production systems up and running at their companies without needing a PhD in like artificial intelligence. And, if this was a conversation we were having maybe, 5-6 years ago or a decade ago, this would be a pipe dream, I'd argue. The needs from an infrastructure and a DevOps perspective, and then a software engineering perspective, and then a mathematical background, before NumPy and all of these libraries that did those low-level bit flips for us, it would be a very different discussion. I'm really happy to see that there are so many companies that are able to actually take things like regression or classification and actually automate to very high degrees of accuracy with very low sort of like levels of contentiousness and bias that we talk about here in these like very large greenfield sorts of conversations. And AI is powering a lot of, under the hood, a lot of these lower level problems, and businesses see a lot of really, really real and tangible gains from that without having to sort of like perform this really big set of mental math around like, is this good or is this bad or is this worthwhile to do? So seeing the democratization from the tooling and the education and all of that is something that I've been very happy to see.
Does anybody want to kick it off next, or?
Something I'm excited for is, I guess, the accessibility aspect. When I took human-computer interaction in college, my professor had one child who had a disability, and he was very excited for the concept of voice tech and making tools that more people could use. And I think this is a good jumpstart to a conversation on, I guess, diversifying and getting people of different backgrounds to build these tools so more people can be included, and so we can build for everyone, so everyone can use tools like AI. And also, a cool project I saw on GitHub or somewhere recently was writing code via voice, and like, what was it called? I forget the company, but definitely need people of more different backgrounds. And I kind of like the idea of having humanities with tech, and I think that's where ethics in AI definitely leads into.
If you want, I can kick it off next.
Yeah.
So this is well, Lizzie and I both work at Twilio. One of our customers is the crisis text helpline. So one of the cool things with them is that they also use AI to actually help people like not commit suicide. So people who are on the fence, they have basically taken a look at, as dark as it sounds, they've taken a look at what's worked and what hasn't worked in the past, so that they can actually kind of prescribe, like, how do you react in the situation when this is, basically the phrases in the text leading up to a specific situation. How do you walk somebody back from like the edge? And I think that that's like a really kind of good use of AI, is being able to help influence a decision when people feel like there's no hope left. And I think for a lot of stuff, like you think about, again, I don't want to make things dark, but going back to like coronavirus, there's a lot of people who are hopeless, feeling isolated, lonely. Like it's not a good time, like for a lot of mental health right now. So I feel like AI is really, it's kind of going to help. I mean, it's helping now, but it's also going to help in the future of, how do you have someone to talk to that is not going to judge you? And, you think about like good chatbots, or, people in the mix who now have, an additional decision maker who's helping them make the right call. So that they don't have to feel, 100% responsible if things don't go, the right way. And it's, a lot of times people just want somebody else to say something to. And I think that there's pros and cons here. You also see this like in robotics too, where it's like, I forget if it was like Joby or some of these other, like, it's like the robots you can have at home, which are, keeping people company. And it's just like a cute little thing that's going to, walk around the house, and you don't feel as isolated. Bring some kind of joy. And I think that, there is an opportunity to create more joyful experiences, and not necessarily just use AI and like machine learning for evil. So there is always that positive side of that as well.
Definitely. So one of the thing I can think of right now is like from last 2 months, I have seen many things coming around fake news, and I worked around this thing a bit, and then I like delivered 2 or 3 talks as well. So when I read a lot about it, so I found out that there's no human review system which can really fight this thing. So when you talk about fake news, it can be generated by GANs as well. So there are a lot of sources for this, but we don't we as a human, can't really fight the whole thing. So AI can play a really great role when it comes to fighting this kind of things, like combating fake news. Then some kind of like very good real world issues can be solved using AI very easily, and it can really help as a when it coexisting with the human. It can really we can really form a good pair and work around so many great problems, and solve many great issues around lot of general things, or real world issues.
Nice. Nice. Cool. So if there's no more thoughts, I would like to thank you, Scott, Nick, Lizzie, and Jayesh, for some
And
great takeaways. Sorry.
one final
Yeah.
thing I will add.
Sure. Go ahead.
Recently I came across this conversation where uh, that ended on this thought that
Yeah.
if we as an algorithm developer, or if we as an application developer want to develop something, and then we should think about how this problem, or how this model can impact people in general life, or what will be risk on the human lives about it. So this a short thought before developing something can help us solve the many ethical issues we think around AI, I guess.
Yep.
Right.
Agreed.
Makes sense. Great. So thank you again. Thanks, Scott, Nick, Lizzie, Jayesh, for some great takeaways across the different aspects of the ethics in AI. And I'm sure this will kick off a lot more discussions among our viewers, and we'll be able to build better AI systems in the future. So thank you again. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
All right,
Thank you.
bye.
Right.
Bye.